From death by 1,000 cuts in imperial China, to being eaten alive by insects in ancient Persia, to having molten silver poured into your skull by the Mongols, these are the worst punishments from every major empire. 15. Crucifixion, the Roman Empire. In 71 BC, the slave rebellion led by Spartacus finally collapsed. The Roman general Crassus wanted to send a message. He lined the Appian Way with 6,000 crosses, each one carrying the body of a captured rebel. The road stretched for over 100 miles. Travelers entering Rome passed corpse after corpse, rotting in the Italian sun. Crucifixion was Rome's punishment for those who challenged the state: slaves, rebels, pirates. The condemned were flogged first, their backs torn open by whips embedded with metal. Then they carried the crossbeam to the execution site, often collapsing under the weight. Iron nails were driven through the wrists, not the palms, which would tear under the body's weight. A single nail pinned both feet sideways to the post. Death came slowly. The victim could breathe only by pushing up on the nails, a movement that grew weaker over hours or days. Eventually, the legs gave out, the lungs filled, and the condemned suffocated in full view of the public. 14. Damnatio ad bestias, the Roman Empire. If crucifixion was Rome's warning to outsiders, the arena was its entertainment, and nothing drew a crowd like watching criminals die at the jaws of wild animals. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, was part of the midday program at the Colosseum, scheduled between the morning animal hunts and the afternoon gladiator fights. The condemned were brought out during the lunch break. Some were tied to stakes, others were given wooden weapons and told to fight. The animals had been starved for days, sometimes weeks. Lions, bears, leopards, wild dogs, all released at once while 50,000 spectators watched from the stands. The beasts went for the throat, the stomach, the limbs. Death could come in minutes or stretch into a prolonged mauling, depending on the animal's mood. Christians, runaway slaves, and convicted murderers all met this fate. For Rome, their deaths weren't just punishment, they were public spectacle. 13. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. British Empire. In 1305, the Scottish rebel William Wallace was dragged through the streets of London behind a horse. Then he was hanged, but cut down before he died. What followed was designed to be the most painful death the English crown could inflict. Hanged, drawn, and quartered was England's punishment for high treason. The sentence was explicit. The condemned would be dragged to the execution site, hanged by the neck but not until dead, cut down while still conscious, then castrated, disemboweled, and forced to watch his own entrails burned before his eyes. Only after this did the executioner deliver the mercy of beheading. The body was then hacked into 4 pieces. The head and quarters were parboiled to prevent rot and displayed on spikes across the kingdom, a warning that treason meant not just death, but the complete destruction of the body. The punishment remained on the books in England until 1870. Hundreds of men suffered it, including the conspirators behind the Gunpowder Plot in 1606. Women convicted of treason were burned at the stake instead, for reasons of public decency. 12. Auto da fe, the Spanish Empire. In 1680, King Charles II of Spain celebrated his marriage with a public execution. 50,000 people gathered in Madrid's Plaza Mayor to watch 118 accused heretics receive their sentences. Some were flogged, some were imprisoned, and some were led to the burning place. The auto da fe, act of faith, was the Spanish Inquisition's public ceremony of condemnation. Accused heretics were paraded through the streets in pointed hats and yellow robes painted with flames. Crowds lined the route, church bells rang. The procession moved through the city like a festival, and in a sense, it was. At the Quemadero, the burning place, the unrepentant were chained to stakes. Bundles of wood were stacked at their feet, and as the flames rose, the condemned screamed until their lungs filled with smoke and their bodies blackened. The Inquisition lasted over 350 years. Historians estimate that between 3,000 and 5,000 people were burned at the stake. Many more were tortured into confession and sentenced to lesser punishments, but the burnings were the spectacle the crowds came to see. 11. Boiling alive, the Japanese shogunate. In feudal Japan, your punishment depended on your class. Samurai who committed serious crimes were often granted the right to die with honor, by their own hand, through ritual seppuku. Commoners received no such privilege. For crimes like arson, robbery, or murder, commoners could be sentenced to kamayude, death by boiling. The condemned was bound and lowered into a massive iron pot filled with water or oil. A fire was lit beneath, and as the liquid heated, the victim thrashed and screamed until finally going still. Executions took place at designated grounds on the outskirts of Edo, positioned along major roads so travelers entering the city would see the bodies. The message was clear: the shogunate's laws applied to everyone, but the punishments did not. 10. Sawing. The Japanese shogunate. Some crimes demanded more than a quick death. For those who killed their lord, the ultimate betrayal in a society built on loyalty, the shogunate devised something slower. The condemned was buried in the ground up to the neck with only the head exposed. A bamboo saw was placed nearby. Then, for 2 days, the criminal remained there while passers-by were invited to take the saw and make cuts along the neck. In theory, anyone could participate. In practice, the cuts were shallow, enough to wound but not enough to kill. The actual execution came afterward, usually by crucifixion. But the 2 days of public humiliation, of waiting for strangers to carve into your flesh, was the real punishment. By the later Edo period, the sawing had become symbolic. The saw was placed beside the condemned but rarely used. Still, the ritual survived as a reminder of what betrayal once cost. 9. Molten silver, the Mongol Empire. In 1219, a trade caravan of 500 Mongol merchants arrived at the city of Otrar in the Khwarezmian Empire. The city's governor, Inalchuk, accused them of being spies. He executed every last one and seized their goods. Genghis Khan sent diplomats to demand justice. The Shah of Khwarezm responded by beheading one ambassador and shaving the beards of the others, a profound insult in Mongol culture. What followed was the complete destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire and the deaths of millions. When Inalchuk was finally captured, the Mongols devised a punishment that fit his crime. He had killed for greed, so they poured molten silver into his eyes and ears, filling his head with the very wealth he had stolen for. The Mongols had a religious prohibition against spilling noble blood, but they found creative alternatives. Nobles were rolled in carpets and trampled by horses, others were suffocated or had their backs broken. The prohibition didn't prevent death, it just made it more imaginative. 8. Impalement. The Ottoman Empire. In 1462, Sultan Mehmed II marched his army toward the Wallachian capital of Târgoviște. 60 miles from the city, his forces stopped. Before them stretched a forest of stakes, and on every stake, a body. 20,000 Ottoman prisoners had been impaled on Vlad III's orders. Men, women, children. The stakes entered through the lower body and exited near the shoulder or mouth, depending on the executioner's skill. The bodies had been arranged in rows, some still alive, writhing on the poles. The stench of decay filled the valley. Mehmed, who had conquered Constantinople itself, reportedly turned his army around. Impalement was designed to maximize suffering. A skilled executioner avoided the vital organs, keeping the victim alive for days. The stake was oiled to prevent too much bleeding, and the condemned was left to die slowly, suspended above the ground, visible to anyone who passed. Vlad earned his nickname, the Impaler, through liberal use of this method, but the Ottomans themselves employed it for centuries against rebels, bandits, and enemies of the state. 7. Execution by elephant. The Mughal Empire. In Mughal India, elephants were more than symbols of royal power. They were instruments of execution. Trained from a young age, execution elephants learned to follow commands: crush the head, break the limbs, drag the body. The Mahout, the elephant's handler, directed every movement, and the animal obeyed with terrifying precision. The Mughal Emperor Jahangir reportedly had criminals crushed for his own amusement. French traveler François Bernier witnessed several executions and recorded his dismay at the pleasure the emperor took in watching. The condemned would be placed on the ground, sometimes with their head on a stone pedestal. The elephant would then step forward and press down until the skull shattered. But death wasn't always quick. If the emperor wished, the elephant could be commanded to break the victim's limbs one by one, tossing the body into the air before finishing the job. In some regions, elephants were fitted with blades on their tusks, allowing them to slice prisoners apart. The practice continued until the British suppressed it in the 19th century. By then, execution by elephant had been used across South and Southeast Asia for over 2,000 years. 6. Flaying alive. The Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians didn't just punish their enemies, they advertised it. In the 9th century BC, King Ashur-nasir-pal II crushed a rebellion in the city of Suru. His response was recorded in detail on the walls of his palace. I flayed as many nobles as had rebelled against me and draped their skins over the pile of corpses. Some I spread out within the pile, some I erected on stakes. Flaying, the removal of skin from a living body, was one of the Assyrians' signature methods. The victim was restrained while executioners cut into the flesh, peeling the skin away in strips. Death came eventually from shock, blood loss, or exposure, but not quickly. The Assyrians built their empire on terror. They impaled prisoners, gouged out eyes, cut off hands and feet, and built pyramids of severed heads outside conquered cities. And they documented everything in royal inscriptions and palace reliefs that survive to this day. The goal was psychological. A city that heard what happened to the last one that resisted might surrender without a fight. And for the Assyrians, that calculation often proved correct. 5. Heart extraction, the Aztec Empire. At the top of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan, priests waited with obsidian blades. Below them, a line of captives stretched down the temple steps. The Aztecs believed the sun required human blood to rise each morning. Without sacrifice, the world would end, and so they fed it by the thousands. The victim was stretched across a curved stone, chest thrust upward. A priest drove the blade beneath the ribs, reached into the cavity, and tore out the still beating heart. The heart was held aloft, offered to the sun, then placed in a stone vessel. The body was rolled down the pyramid steps, where attendants collected it for further ritual use. Spanish conquistadors recorded their horror at what they witnessed. But for the Aztecs, this was sacred duty. The victims, often captured warriors, were not merely killed. They were transformed into messengers to the gods. 4. Flaying for Xipe-Totec, the Aztec Empire. Some Aztec sacrifices didn't end with death. Xipe-Totec, our Lord the Flayed One, was the god of spring, renewal, and agriculture. His worship required a specific ritual. Captured warriors were selected 40 days before the festival. They lived as the god's embodiment, dressed in his garments, honored by the city. Then, at the climax of the ceremony, they were sacrificed. Their hearts were cut out, and their skin was carefully removed in a single piece. Priests donned the skins, wearing them for the 20-day duration of the festival as they walked through the city collecting gifts. The skins were dyed yellow, called golden clothes, and represented the earth shedding its dead surface to reveal new life beneath. The Spanish recorded their revulsion, but for the Aztecs, the flaying was not desecration, it was transformation. The victim became the god, and the priests who wore the skins became living images of divine renewal. 3. Lingqi, Imperial China. The name translates as slow slicing, or the lingering death. In the West, it became known as death by 1,000 cuts. Lingqi was reserved for the worst crimes in Imperial China: high treason, patricide, mass murder. The condemned was tied to a wooden frame in a public square. Then, using a sharp knife, the executioner began to cut. The slices started at the chest, removing the flesh above the ribs, then the arms, then the legs. The number of cuts varied, from a few dozen to, according to some accounts, over 3,000, depending on the crime and the sentencing court. A skilled executioner avoided major arteries, keeping the victim conscious as long as possible. Death came eventually from blood loss or shock, but the punishment didn't end there. In Confucian belief, the body needed to be whole to enter the afterlife properly. Lingqi denied the condemned that wholeness. The soul was left mutilated forever. The practice was abolished in 1905. Photographs exist of one of the final executions, images that circulated in Europe and fueled Western perceptions of Chinese cruelty. But scholars note that by the late Qing dynasty, many victims were given opium beforehand, and death often came faster than the legends suggest. 2. The Triple Death, the Persian Empire. When Cyrus the Younger died in battle against his brother, King Artaxerxes II, multiple people claimed credit for the kill. One was a soldier named Mithridates, who had been promised a reward for his role. But when Mithridates got drunk at a banquet and boasted that he, not the king, had struck the fatal blow, he sealed his fate. Artaxerxes ordered him to die 3 times. First, Mithridates was placed on a wheel and left in the sun for 10 days. Then his eyes were gouged out. Finally, molten brass was poured into his ears. Only after this prolonged sequence of tortures was he allowed to die. Another man, a Carian soldier who claimed to have wounded Cyrus, suffered even longer. According to the historian Plutarch, Queen Parysatis, Cyrus's mother, personally oversaw his punishment. He was tortured for 10 days, blinded, and then had molten metal poured into his ears before finally being executed. The Persians believed some crimes demanded more than a single death. For betrayal of this magnitude, the body had to be destroyed in stages, each stage a separate reckoning. Punishment 1. Scaphism. The Persian Empire. The victim was stripped naked and placed between 2 boats, one inverted over the other like a shell. Holes were cut for the head, hands, and feet to protrude. Then the feeding began. Milk and honey were poured into the victim's mouth until diarrhea set in. The the same mixture was smeared over the exposed face, hands, and feet, particularly the eyes, ears, and genitals. Then the boats were set afloat in a stagnant pond and left in the sun. Flies came first. They swarmed the honey-coated flesh, laying eggs in the wounds and orifices. The victim's own filth accumulated inside the boats, breeding more insects and vermin. Maggots hatched and began to feed, not just on dead tissue, but on living flesh, burrowing into the body from the inside. Every day, the victim was fed again. More milk, more honey. The goal was not to let death come quickly. The goal was to keep the body alive as long as possible while it was consumed from within. According to Plutarch, the soldier Mithridates, before his triple death, was also sentenced to this fate by some accounts. He reportedly survived 17 days before finally dying, his body rotting and devoured while he remained conscious. Historians debate whether scaphism was actually practiced, or if it was exaggerated by Greek writers eager to portray Persians as barbarians. The only detailed account comes from Plutarch, citing Ctesias, a Greek physician who served at the Persian court and was known for embellishment. No Persian sources confirm the practice, but if even a fraction of the account is true, scaphism may be the most horrifying method of execution ever devised, a punishment designed not to end life, but to make the victim wish it would. Every empire in history has faced the same question: how do you make people obey? Some chose laws, some chose armies, and some chose fear. The punishments on this list weren't just about justice. They were about power, the power to make death itself into a message. And for the millions who lived under these empires, that message was clear: obey, or become the warning. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And there's another video on screen right now that's even better.